Welcome to your third software primer. In this video, I'm going to be discussing some additional techniques for editing images using Adobe Photoshop. So to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and open the image that we were previously working with in the Photoshop Part 1 software primer, this image of the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe. The first thing that I want to review is the principle of creating a mask using selections. So in the previous video, we talked about all the various selection tools that are available to us. The rectangular marquee tool is the most commonly used. The polygon lasso tool, which is also very frequently used for grabbing more specific areas. If you click and hold on the polygon lasso tool, you will also be able to access the freehand lasso tool, the magnetic lasso tool, which is also sometimes called the quick selection tool, and then below that there's also the magic wand. So to begin with, I'm going to generate a mask just by way of reminding you how this works. I'm going to take my polygon tool, polygon lasso tool, and you'll notice that as I begin to create a selection, if I hold my cursor off to the side of the screen while I'm drawing my lasso, it's going to go ahead and scroll automatically for me, which is one of the nice things that Photoshop has built in terms of navigating and the interface. So I could be as careful as I want while I'm very zoomed in, grabbing this house, grabbing whatever I want to in the image. I may be a little more sloppy as we get towards the end, just because I want to generate the selection fairly quickly. So let's say, just for argument's sake, that this is good enough, and I'm satisfied with this selection. I double-clicked to end it. So obviously I could improve this. If I wanted to modify my selection, again, I could always add to it by holding Shift, and you'll see that I get this plus icon, or by holding Alt if I wanted to subtract from it, for example, this area here that's actually underneath the house. You may also notice that at times my cursor, as I'm doing this, goes very rigid suddenly, like this, where it's at a 90-degree angle or a 45-degree angle, and that's because I'm holding Shift while I'm using the tool, which will force it to behave in an orthogonal fashion. So let's say that this selection is good enough for our purposes. We've more or less selected the house. When I'm ready to generate a mask, I can hit this button down here at the bottom of my layer stack that looks like the Japanese flag. If I hover over it, it tells me I'm going to add a mask. And you'll also notice that the background layer was locked while I did this operation. Adding a mask to a layer will, by default, unlock it. So if you're only working with one layer in your document, this is a way to get started if you don't want to double-click and unlock the background layer. So I've created my mask, and you can see that it is here indicated to the side of my layer thumbnail. There's the image thumbnail on the left and the mask thumbnail on the right. Last time we discussed the fact that they are linked together with this little icon in the middle. We can unlink them or keep them linked together, which is fine for right now. If we want to disable our mask temporarily, we can either right-click on it and choose Disable Layer Mask. We can also enable it the same way, or we can hold Shift on our keyboard and click on it, and that's going to quickly disable it and give us a preview. So now that we've generated our mask, we may say that we want to go ahead and modify it a little bit further. Say we want to clean up this selection that I've made. Fortunately, masks are very flexible, and we are able to paint into this in a variety of ways. So to begin with, I'm going to disable my layer mask and take a look at more closely some of the areas that my selection was a little bit less than sufficient. So if I enable it again, you can see that we're missing part of this column that goes down to the ground, and I should probably eliminate some of this here in the background. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about the fill method of modifying your mask. I'm going to generate a selection here for the area that I want to eliminate. I'm going to double-click to close my selection. And when I come back here, I make sure that my mask is selected, not my image, and I can right-click while using any of my selection tools, any of the marquee tools, and navigate down to, I did a right-click on the screen, and I'm going to navigate down to Fill. And since we talked about previously, the mask is kind of a binary language, meaning either or, yes or no, 0 or 1. White means that it's going to show, black means that it's going to hide. Black is, remember, the piece of paper that's covering up everything. So if I fill that area in black, it's going to hide everything there. So I'm painting on the mask in black, and you'll notice that it's not actually painting anything black, it's painting the mask black. So the mask is thinking of that as the hide language. By that same token, if I wanted to make sure that I just enabled my mask again, or excuse me, I disabled my mask again, and I'm grabbing this column here, I'm going to enable it again so I can see what I'm doing. By that same token, if I wanted to show this here, I could right click on it, go to fill, and then select white, because white is going to be show in the language of the masks binary. So if you just keep that in mind, it takes a little while to wrap your head around it at first, that white is show and black is hide, but it actually makes a lot of sense once you've worked with it for a little bit. We can also use paintbrushes, actually, the paintbrush tool, to paint directly onto our mask if we have an area that we want to add a little bit of softness to, for example. Say we wanted to bring back, let's disable our mask, say we wanted to bring back a little of this grass in the foreground for whatever reason. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my toolbar on the left and select the paintbrush tool right here. We used this very briefly in the previous tutorial. So by default, I'm going to get a circular brush. There are a whole bunch of brushes that are available in the paintbrush palette. We'll probably talk about them later this semester. There is actually a grass paintbrush which does a pretty good job of simulating grass, but for now let's keep it simple. Let's just worry about the circular brush. So if I open this rollout, you'll see that I can control the size with a slider. It's 300 pixels by default for me. If I make the size smaller, you'll see that the brush tip gets smaller. I can go as large as 5,000 pixels, which is so large you can't even see it on my screen right now. There we go. We can get it back that way. And you can also affect the hardness. If you're trying to do something that's very precise, you may want to crank the hardness all the way up to 100 or close to 100, which means that it's going to behave sort of like a hard graphite pencil. And if it's closer to 0, it's going to be a little bit softer, like an airbrush. So I'm going to just guess that 0% hardness is what we want for some vegetation, because it wants to be a little bit softer and more natural looking. So I'm going to enable my layer mask again, remembering that my grass was somewhere down here. This size may be a little bit too big, so I could come up here and change the size of my brush using the slider, or I prefer to use the keyboard shortcut, the bracket keys, which are right next to the backslash and your backspace key. If I do the left bracket, my brush tip is going to get smaller. The right bracket, my brush tip is going to get larger. So I can control that directly from my keyboard. And since I want to show some of the vegetation down there, again, I want to make sure that my mask is activated. That's what I'm working on, and you can tell because it's got these 4 little white brackets surrounding it. If I were working on the image, if I had the image selected, I'd be painting white directly on the picture, which is bad. But instead, we're going to paint onto our mask, which is a non-destructive editing technique, another thing we discussed previously. So with white selected, because that's going to show, I'm going to start painting directly on my mask, and that's going to start revealing whatever is behind it. Again, likewise, if I want to flip the color that I'm using, you'll see that white is my foreground color, black is my background color, and if I want to flip that and start painting in black, anywhere on that mask that I paint, it's going to start hiding things and acting like it's erasing them. So this is why I recommend never using the eraser tool unless you're 100% certain that you will never use that image again, because the eraser tool is destructive and you can use masks by painting black and white to get the exact same effects without permanently modifying your image file. So I'm going to right click on our mask here and choose Delete Layer Mask. I also wanted to just quickly talk about the fact that you can paste into an image mask, and this is a little bit of a confusing issue, but I think that if I illustrate it, it'll make it a little bit more clear. So if I were to grab this image here, select the whole thing using my rectangular marquee tool, and I'm going to go to Edit, Copy. It's going to copy the image to my clipboard. I could paste it in again. You'll see it came in as another layer. I'm going to go ahead and delete that layer using the delete button down here, or delete on my keyboard. But I could also use that image to generate a mask. So I'm going to turn off this layer to illustrate this. And I'm going to go ahead and come down to my fill layers and create a solid color layer that's black. We're going to talk more about these in just a few moments. So you'll see that the black layer came in by default with a mask, and the mask is entirely white. So as you remember, that means that it's showing what's on the layer completely. There's nothing that's hidden. And this black box here is indicating that it's a solid black fill that we've created. If I hold Alt on my keyboard and click on this layer mask, it's going to appear as though everything's turned white, but what I'm really seeing is the mask represented as a full screen image. So right now I'm editing the mask, and if I again go to Edit and say Paste, to paste that image in, it's going to come in as black and white, and that's because masks only think in black and white, and I'm not working on the actual image, I'm just working on the mask. And you can kind of see that in the thumbnail here. You see the way that the thumbnail looks a little bit like a black and white representation of what we're seeing down here. So then, when I click on the eye icon for this layer, remember our background layer is turned off, we're just looking at the black fill layer. What I've done is I've generated a layer mask that corresponds to that photograph. So this is kind of an interesting way that you can start playing with layer masks and thinking about how we want to control our image and how we want to work on it. I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer using the delete key on my keyboard and turn my background layer on again. So I think this is probably an appropriate time to discuss fill layers since I just generated one. Anytime that you want to generate a solid color or a gradient in Photoshop, it is tempting to think that the right tool to use is either the gradient tool or the paint bucket tool, but I recommend that you basically forget these tools exist for this semester because they are primarily destructive editing tools, and there is a much more effective way to create colors using the fill layer button. So again, if I wanted to create a fill layer, I would come down here to the button that looks like a black and white cookie, create new fill or adjustment layer, and these top three here are all fill layers. We're not going to discuss patterns today because patterns are a little bit trickier and more specialized, but we will address them later. Solid color is the first one. If I choose to add a solid color, by default it comes in as white, but I can use the hue slider here and then navigate the saturation and the darkness using this larger square to choose any color from the visible spectrum that I want to place into my image. When I hit OK, we're good. So, and you can see that just like the black fill layer that I created a moment ago, this one comes in with a white layer mask, meaning that it is going to be 100% visible. I could delete the layer mask and there's no visible effect because it's the exact same. The layer mask was completely transparent essentially. If I'm going to undo and leave it there. As with images, we could start painting directly onto it with our paintbrush tool. If I were to use black, we would start to hide parts of it. Another very common way to work with masks is to think about inverting them because the black and white language, the binary of that can be a little confusing sometimes, but we can very quickly invert it, meaning flipping everything that's black to white and vice versa. If we hold Control on our keyboard, again making sure that we have our mask selected, if we are holding Control and hit I, it will flip our mask from positive to negative essentially, so everything that we were previously showing we are now hiding. I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer. And just as we did with some adjustment layers in the last video, if we were to create a selection, let's use the lasso tool this time, the freehand lasso tool. So if I were to create a selection here, and while that selection is still dancing on my screen, if I navigated to the solid color fill layer, it will come in with a mask already generated that corresponds to the selection I had just created. I'm going to go ahead and actually before I delete this, just quickly a moment on why this is advantageous and why you should be using this instead of the paint bucket tool or the gradient tool, which is that you can modify this anytime the mask and the color are independent of each other. So if I simply double click on the color here, I can again choose to change this to any color with very minimal effort and not worrying about modifying my mask. So using fill layers is a very effective way to add color to your document anywhere that you should need it. I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to create another selection to talk about the next fill layer tool that we will often use. So if I were to generate another selection, it's kind of a interesting shape, I can come down here to my fill layers, and rather than a solid color, I can also choose to add a gradient. And a gradient is basically a smooth transition between a series of colors and opacities. So when you select the gradient tool, we're going to get this gradient fill dialog box. There is a gradient that is set to it by default. Yours may or may not look like mine, which is a white transitioning to transparency. If we click this drop-down menu, you'll see you have a whole bunch of presets here. Yours may look a little different than mine. I've generated a few of my own presets. You can also click directly on it, and then that will call up the gradient editor, which is where you can create a new gradient. And you can save these to the machine, but be conscious of the fact that you shouldn't rely on them too heavily, because they are going to live on the hard drive of the machine that they are created on, and you may not always be working on the same machine if you're in a lab. However, your Photoshop file will remember any gradients you create, and they will come with the file, so feel free to customize them. Just don't plan on them being available in other files. So if I wanted to create a gradient, let me just explain these tools very quickly. So essentially, we have a slider down here. Let me choose a different gradient that makes this a little more apparent. The red to green is a good one. Okay, so we have a slider down here with 4 controls to begin with. The lower 2 controls control the color of the gradient. You can see that this one is transitioning from red to green. It's not a particularly attractive color scheme. So let's say, for argument's sake, we want to change one of these. Let's make this a red to yellow gradient. I can click on this color stop, and I could either click on the color here, or I could simply double click on the color stop, and then this will allow me to change a new a new color for that. So I said I wanted to do a red to yellow. So here I've chosen a yellow color. I'm going to choose a very vibrant yellow and hit OK. So now we are transitioning from red to yellow. If I wanted, I could add additional color stops in the middle by simply clicking in this blank area here. Let's say I wanted to make sure that I wanted to go backwards in the visible spectrum, so I wanted it to transition from red to magenta, then to yellow. I could add a magenta color stop. And the proximity of this, you'll notice this in my image, the proximity of this color stop to the other color stops is going to affect how quickly that transition happens. So you'll notice that here, the transition between red to magenta is very extended, and the transition from magenta to yellow is very abbreviated. But the opposite will be true if I bring this slider all the way to the other end, where the transition between magenta to yellow becomes very extended. And I accidentally just added another color stop here, so this brings up the point of what happens if you have an additional color stop you want to get rid of. You can simply right-click on it, or excuse me, I'm thinking of an older version. You can simply click on this color stop to make sure we are viewing it. You can see the little triangle on top of it is dark, indicating that this is the one we're working on. And there's a delete button down here in the lower right-hand corner. So now I've gotten rid of the unwanted color stop. And for an added degree of control, there's also these small diamond-shaped markers, the color midpoint, which we can slide to the left or the right, and you can see to the left of my gradient editor exactly how that's affecting the gradient. So let's delete this color stop and just stick with red to yellow for now. These 2 stops here on the top, these are called opacity stops, and these control, as you might imagine, the opacity of your gradient. So if I wanted to say that the red was slightly more transparent than the yellow, I could change the opacity of it, making sure it's activated, and drop this down to 30%, 10%, 0%, and now you'll see that we've got a red portion of the gradient here, which is actually primarily transparent, and then transitioning up to a fully opaque yellow portion here. So we have a great deal of control over gradients and colors using these fill layers. Pardon me, I wanted to illustrate one other thing about this. If I open up this gradient again and click the New button after I've created this, you'll notice that the gradient we worked on just now has been added to our custom gradients. So now when I hit OK, as long as we're in this file and on this machine, this will be available from the Gradient Fill dialog box. We can also change the style of gradient. You can experiment with these to see what works for the effect that you are trying to achieve. We can also change the angle of the gradient, meaning does it begin at 90 degrees, does it begin at 180 degrees, and you can change the scale of it below. You'll see that it appears to get larger. By default, when we create a gradient, it wants to fit itself to whatever the mask is. So if our gradient is moving from the bottom of the screen towards the top, it's going to sort of detect what is the upper limit of our mask and the lower limit of our mask, and fit the gradient to that. Again, as with the color fills, if I double click the thumbnail of the gradient, it'll allow me to edit it. I also neglected to mention that if you check the reverse option here, it will flip the direction of the gradient. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm satisfied with this for now. So that is how to add a fill layer. We talked about solid colors and we talked about gradients. We've also talked about editing masks. As with everything else that we've discussed today, you could edit the mask applied to a gradient using a fill, such as the marquee tool. I could come in here and say that I want to subtract this portion of my mask by right-clicking on it, going to fill, and then selecting black to get rid of that portion. I'm going to do a step backwards. I could also use my paintbrush tool and paint on it in white or black. If I paint on it in white, as I have selected right now, it's going to change the mapping of my gradient slightly because I'm changing the extents of my mask, but it's going to just build on it, and it's going to give me this soft edge that the paintbrush is set to. So again, we have a tremendous amount of flexibility using the fill tools, the paintbrush, and working with masks. So another great reason to work with masks is that we can actually use masks to generate selections. And to illustrate this very quickly, I'm going to turn off this background layer and I'm going to generate a few shapes using solid fill colors. So if I draw a rectangle here, create a solid color, let's make this one red. And if I create another rectangle here, let's make this one blue to make this very simple. This also, really quickly, illustrates an issue about layer organization. Whenever we create new layers, to prevent our document from becoming confusing and to keep it organized, we should double-click on the layer name and name them something logical. This one, I'm going to call it red rectangle. I'm going to double-click on the blue and title this blue rectangle. As I mentioned before, the way in which the layers are stacked on top of each other controls what is visible. If I were to bring the blue rectangle layer to the top of the layer stack, it now sits on top of the red rectangle. So we can use our masks, as I mentioned, to modify selections and generate marquee selections, which can be extremely helpful. If I right-click on one of these mask thumbnails, I have these options down here. The first one is to add mask to selection. And that, as I mentioned, I'm going to activate my marquee tool. It's going to generate a marquee that corresponds exactly to the mask. I'm going to click off of that to deselect it. I could also hold Control on my keyboard, and when I hover over my layer mask icon here, you'll notice that I'm getting a little marquee icon, and if I were to click on that with the left mouse button, it will generate that same selection for me. So that's just a keyboard shortcut to achieve that. You can add to selections using multiple masks. So if I had already generated a selection here and I wanted to add the red rectangle, I could also come to the red rectangle's layer mask, right-click on it and say Add Mask to Selection. So now I have these two masks that have created one selection together. Again, I could use the keyboard shortcuts. I'm holding Control and clicking on the blue. And if I hold Control and Shift, you'll see that I get a little plus icon there, and I can add the red. I could then use these if I wanted to create another layer. Let's say I wanted to make a purple shape that corresponded to the intersection between the two. By default, it came in between my two layers, which is why it doesn't appear to be visible. But if I drag it to the top, you'll see now this layer is really describing the area that is shared by both of them. If I were to generate a selection holding Control and clicking on this, or by right-clicking and choosing Add Mask Selection, I could then also use my other layer masks to subtract from it. For example, I could come in here and right-click the blue layer mask and say Subtract Mask from Selection, and now you'll see that I have the area that is just occupied by the red rectangle and not the blue rectangle. I could also select both of these again, so this is the area that's shared by them, and I could come into my blue layer mask and say that I want to intersect the mask with selection. And what this will do is it will identify only the area in which my current selection is intersecting that mask. So you'll see that it selected just the blue rectangle. Perhaps a better illustration of this would be if I had generated an additional selection over here and I wanted to locate the area in which it is just intersecting the blue. I would perform that same operation, and now you'll see that it's grabbed just this portion of the rectangle that intersected the marquee that I drew. So that's a very helpful functionality that's included with Photoshop, using your masks to generate selections. Very often when I'm working with an image, I'll have a series of layers that are somewhat abstract like this that I purely use to generate selections. So you'll have to find a way that this works with your workflow. I also want to talk briefly about the idea of image size versus canvas size. If I return just a review to the image size option under image, we want to make sure that we're never resampling our images. That way they stay true to their original pixel size. 1600 by 1064 is this one's dimension. And we want to be working at 300 pixels per inch. If we're intending to print anything that we're working on. Can hit OK. And that hasn't really changed the extents that we're looking at. It's simply changed my ruler and changed the resolution that Photoshop is thinking of our image in. But there's also the notion of the canvas, which is the larger workspace. So we're not always going to be working on simply one image. Very often we're going to be compositing multiple images together, such as in this week's photo montage assignment. So the way that we can control our canvas is by navigating to Image in the menu bar and selecting Canvas Size. And what this is going to do, you'll notice that it's no longer giving us a dimension in pixels, it's giving us a dimension in inches, because this is corresponding to essentially the page that we're working on. So we have an image that's right now the full size of the page, but we could hypothetically say that we want to change this to a letter-sized piece of paper, and we want to change the width to 11 inches and the height to 8.5 inches. And you'll notice that when I hit OK, it's gone ahead and expanded the canvas. So now my image is kind of floating in this larger workspace that's 11 inches, as indicated by the ruler, 11 inches wide and 8.5 inches tall. So if you want to be very precise and control the size of the page that you're working on, or the canvas in Photoshop's terms, remember that there is a distinction between image size, which will stretch or change the resolution of the entire image, and canvas size, which is going to change the size of your workspace. And don't be afraid to make the canvas size a little bit bigger than you need it to be, because we can always crop the image later, either using Photoshop or, more desirably, InDesign. So if we have this larger workspace, let's talk about adding some additional layers to this. We could navigate to another file and copy and paste in, but Photoshop actually has another actually, let me illustrate why this is not the best way to add an image. So I'm going to navigate to another folder that I've set up with some images to manipulate. Here I have a potted plant. So I could take my marquee tool, and you'll notice, just as with InDesign, I have multiple tabs open now. Nothing has been closed. They're all still available in these tabs in the system. I could take my marquee tool, select my whole image, holding Control, do Control-C to copy it, or I could navigate up here to Edit Copy. And then here I could either do Control-V to paste, or navigate to Edit and choose Paste. And my potted plant has come in at a relatively small size, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and change my canvas size to reflect a little bit more the area we're actually working in. I believe it was something around 6 inches by 4 inches. So here we have a potted plant that I've dropped in. I'm going to turn off the background layer so we can see this a little more clearly. If I wanted to change the size of this potted plant, the first thing, since we were discussing layer organization, is I should change the name of the layer to reflect what it is. I'm going to call this one potted plant. Unlike with InDesign, we don't have our control handles to begin with. If I have my selection tool modified, I can move my object around, but it's not immediately apparent how I can change it if I wanted to resize or rotate it. And the way that you can access the transformation tools that Photoshop has available is to hold Control on your keyboard and hit the key T. T as in transform. And once we've done that, we're going to get the same handles that look just like InDesign, where we can hold Shift and scale uniformly. We can rotate by hovering over the corner. If I hold Shift, it's going to rotate incrementally like this, snapping to incremental degrees. If I'm not holding Shift, it's going to rotate smoothly. And when I'm satisfied with my transformations, let me illustrate something very quickly. I'm going to shrink this down to a very small size where it's actually quite pixelated. When I'm satisfied with my transformations, I can simply hit Enter, and Photoshop has applied those transformations. So let's say, for argument's sake, that I have accidentally made my potted plant a little bit too small, and now I want to make it larger again. So it's tempting to think that I would select my layer, hold Control, hit T, and enlarge the potted plant back to basically what it was before, but you'll notice it's still pixelated. No matter how large it gets, I'm not able to add more information to the potted plant because that pixel information was lost with that initial scale transformation. So, fortunately, there is a better way to add objects to your document and ensure that this doesn't happen to you, losing pixel information by mistake. I'm going to go ahead and hit the Delete key on my keyboard. You could also delete this layer using the trash can icon down here. I'm going to delete the layer. Rather than copying and pasting my image in, I can navigate to File and choose Place. And this is very similar to the InDesign Place option because it's going to essentially create a link to another image. So again, you want to be conscious of where you're saving your files and try to not move them around, try to name them logical things. So if I choose that same potted plant and I place it into my document, it's going to come in actually at a fairly large size, and it gives me the option to transform it to begin with, but I'm going to just hit Enter to say that I'm happy with my placement. And you'll notice that there's this additional icon in the thumbnail for the potted plant layer now. And the reason that is, it also came in with a layer name, which is kind of a nice convenience. So if you've named your images something intelligent or something logical to begin with, it'll save you a little bit of a headache when it comes to organizing your Photoshop layers. So if I were to apply, this icon means that it's a smart object, meaning that it's linked to somewhere else and it's not entirely dependent on this Photoshop file. So if I were to hold Control, hit T, and apply that same kind of transformation, making my potted plant very small, it appears pixelated to begin with, but if I hold Control T and then transform it again to bring it back, you'll notice that I actually haven't lost that pixel information. So I could easily restore this potted plant to the exact same size that it originally was. So it is possible to copy and paste objects into your Photoshop file, and it may happen that sometimes if you're working quickly and you don't have time to really organize all of your folders, it just happens. But whenever possible, it's much more desirable to work with smart objects because you're less likely to lose pixel information and be able to keep things at a reasonable resolution. So this is how we would add a smart object to our document. There's an additional few transformations that may be useful in your workflow. I'm going to hold Control and hit T to bring up my transformations again. It may happen that you need to flip an object, and there's an easy way to do that. We can hold, after applying the transformation, we can right-click on it, and we get some additional options here. We can flip it horizontally, which is flipping it on its y-axis. We could also flip it vertically, just flipping it on its x-axis. So that's essentially mirroring our object. And it may also happen that we want to distort our object in some way. So if we were to hold Control while we were performing a manipulation, you'll notice that my cursor changed slightly, and I could start to move these different handles around independently of each other and really get some strange results depending on what I wanted to achieve. I'm going to hit Escape and cancel that transformation. Another way to do this is if I hold Control, hit T, bring up my transformations. There are a series of different skew options here. We can right-click and access the skew, the perspective, the distort, or the warp. I recommend you play with these all on your own time, to learn what they do, but the perspective one is particularly useful in photoshopping for architecture. You'll notice that nothing apparently happened when I selected it, but if I begin to manipulate one of these handles, it's going to skew things almost as if the plant were moving further from us or closer to us. So it's going to take advantage of perspectival distortion, and it's going to make manipulations evenly between these handles, as if the plant or whatever object we are manipulating were receding in space. I'm going to go ahead and hit escape and cancel that transformation. So I'm going to go ahead and trim out this white background on this plant using my magic wand tool. The tolerance of 30 should probably be sufficient for now. I'm going to select this. I have contiguous deselected, so it's grabbing all of the white in the image. I'm also going to grab the background here because I don't want any of that. There's a great way to modify your selections ever so slightly if you need to, just to talk about that very briefly. So you may notice that because the tolerance of my magic wand tool was 30, we're actually getting a tiny little bit of white space that surrounds the image. Sometimes people call this a halo. In printing, people often talk about capturing, meaning that you don't want white space around things. And one really easy way that we could manipulate this is, first of all, what I want to do ultimately is generate a mask that's grabbing just the plant. So I'm going to go to Select and choose Inverse. So now I have just the plant selected rather than the background. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take my mask and pull it in about 1 or 2 pixels just to get rid of some of that white space. And Photoshop has a great feature built in under Select here in the menu. If I click Select and come down to Modify, there are all of these different options that allow us to modify a marquee selection we currently have active. And in this case, I would use Contract. That means to pull in. So if I select Contract, it's going to contract it by however many pixels I choose. I'm going to type in 2 as a starting point. And if you watch the marquee closely when this happens, you'll notice that it sort of jumped in just a little bit. And that's actually going to really help the Photoshop file. That's going to make this seem a lot more reasonable and realistic. Just another review of our selection tools. I've noticed that there's a bit of a shine on the plant here that's mistakenly been deselected. Photoshop thought this was part of the background, so I'm actually going to just go ahead and grab that with the lasso tool and add that to my selection. So now I have a reasonable selection area for my potted plant. I'm going to generate a mask. And now you'll see that I have our potted plant floating on an apparently transparent background. I'm going to use my selection tool, move it more to the center of the page. Let's give ourselves a white background just to have something to work on. I'm going to navigate to Solid Color, create a solid fill layer, hit OK. I'm going to bring this all the way to the back, just call it white background. So Photoshop has a few interesting features built in. It has many interesting features built in, but to the layers themselves, one of them that you may find useful in your workflow is called Layer Effects. And the way that we can access that is by either double-clicking on the layer, as long as you're not double-clicking on the name of the layer, but rather somewhere off to the side over here where my mouse is hovering. Or there's also this button at the bottom of the layer stack that says FX. If I click this and navigate to Blending Options, which is what it was called in a previous release of the software, you'll see that this dialog box called Layer Style pops up. And by checking any of these boxes over here, we're going to activate all of these different effects that we can add to the layer. So some of the most common ones that you may find yourself using in your studio work are, let's see here, I believe that drop shadow is often very useful, and you'll notice that when I selected this, it brought me to another menu where I can control the drop shadow, and it's also affecting the image in our workspace. I can zoom in to get a better view of this. And if I play with these sliders, you'll see that it's creating or sort of simulating a shadow as if the plant was something three-dimensional that we're sitting on the page. And we can play with this and make it look, further or closer to the plant. We can change how far it's being projected, how soft it is, how big it is, how blurry it is, and even how opaque it is, if we want it to be very pale or very dark. So drop shadow is a useful one very often. For working with a lot of architectural stuff, you may also find yourself using the inner shadow, the inner glow. The satin sort of simulates a metallic look. And occasionally stroke is useful. We don't have time to address all of these independently. They may be in a future advanced techniques tutorial, but for today, just be aware that these effects are available to you and you can access them by either double-clicking the layer or selecting the Effects button down at the bottom. When I've applied this effect to my layer, it now becomes part of the layer in the layer stack, and I can turn it on or off at any given time because this is also a non-destructive editing technique. I can turn off if I have multiple effects. This eye icon is going to turn them all off at once, or I can control them independently right here. There is also another cool feature called layer modes. And to illustrate this, I'm going to duplicate my potted plant. So I'm going to right click on it and say I want to duplicate this layer. And I'm going to move one of them a little bit down here. Let's see here. So this one is on top here, and this one's going to be our background essentially. So if I were to manipulate this top layer, this is the one that I'm working on right now, you'll notice that there's this drop down that by default says normal, and next to it there's also an opacity control. Opacity, hopefully, is somewhat self-evident, where if we were to play with this slider, our layer is going to become more or less opaque or transparent. So if we slide it all the way to 0, it's going to become completely invisible. 50% in the middle, it's going to be 50% transparent, and all the way to 100%, it's going to be completely opaque. But we have a more nuanced control over how the layer sits with the things below it in this option here, where it currently says normal. And you'll notice that there are a ton of options here. Again, I encourage you to experiment with these and see what they all do. But two that are going to be very useful in your school workflow are multiply, which essentially changes the behavior of our layer so that everything that is a value above 0 is going to be solid and appear, but anything that's a value of white is going to completely disappear. So this is almost as if you had printed your image on an overhead transparency and you were overlaying it on things below it. You'll notice that, for example, when I overlay the pot on the pot below it, it gets a little bit darker because it's almost as if we were combining two overhead transparencies that had the same image printed on them. It's a little bit transparent, but it's not faded as when we controlled the opacity of it. And the inverse of multiply is screen, which will not really do much for this particular image, but it essentially takes everything that is a white value or closer to a light value and makes that opaque, and everything else begins to fall away. So it's kind of like a reverse overhead transparency, or a transparency printed with white ink. So playing with those layer styles is going to really enhance the quality of your image if you do them, if you organize them correctly and use them judiciously. This is also a great technique for adding line work on top of things. If you have a black and white drawing or a shaded drawing with a white background, by simply changing it to multiply mode, it's very easy to give it a more textured or colored background if that's what you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer. So we've discussed layer styles and layer effects. We also need to talk about how to clip adjustment layers. So it may happen that you want to perform an adjustment, and let me bring up my background again. It may happen that you want to perform an adjustment to only one object in your image, not all of the objects in the image. Let me go ahead and name this as well, just to illustrate best practices. So we discussed the notion of non-destructive editing through adding adjustment layers to change the color or the brightness or the saturation of your images. If I come down here and add an adjustment layer, let's say, again, for argument's sake, we wanted to change the hue of our potted plant. I would add a hue and saturation layer, and then I can start playing with my slider here until I'm satisfied. The only problem with this is, say I only want to change the potted plant, I don't want to change everything that's behind it. Photoshop has a very clever way to control exactly what we are adjusting. And the way that works is once I've gone ahead and made any adjustments that I want to make, if I hold Alt on my keyboard and I hover on the space between the adjustment layer and the next layer, you'll notice that the icon that represents my cursor changes to a little white square with a down arrow. Again, I'm holding Alt on my keyboard and hovering on the space between the two layers. And when I click on this, it's going to do what's called clipping the layer. So you'll notice that the layer changes the way it's indented, and it gets this little icon, this tiny little down into the left arrow, indicating that this adjustment layer is only affecting the layer immediately below it. If I add an additional adjustment layer, say levels, I could do the same thing, make some adjustments to this, and again, these aren't very tasteful adjustments. I'm simply trying to illustrate what these controls do. If I hold Alt and hover on the space between this and hue saturation, it's going to stack up all of my adjustments, and these are only going to affect the next image layer below them. I could also unclip them by holding Alt and hovering over that same space, and you'll see that my cursor changes back to the white rectangle, but now it's the down and left arrow with a slash through it, indicating that it's going to get rid of it. So if I click there, you'll see that it's unclipped it, and now my adjustment layers are affecting everything in the entire document. So this is a great way to adjust individual elements, such as entourage figures that you need to change their lighting conditions, but you don't want to affect things that are underneath them. I'm going to go ahead and delete these adjustment layers out of my document. So as a fun way of illustrating how you might begin to pull some of these techniques together, I wanted to illustrate how I might go about beginning a very simple collage if we wanted to make a somewhat surreal or kind of abstract scene. I've got a few images that I thought would be fun to pull together just very quickly. So I'm going to begin by turning everything off. I'm going to delete these layers because I don't believe I'll need them, but I'm going to keep my potted plant in the file for now. I'm going to come down here and create an adjustment layer. Excuse me, I'm going to create a fill layer, is what I meant. I'm going to create a gradient, and I'm going to create a kind of let's see here, let's play with this. Let's create a kind of pinkish to red background. I'm going to hit OK, and let's say I want to illustrate how the screen layer mode works. We already talked about multiply, but just to illustrate how screen works. I want to add an image of some clouds on top of this. So rather than copying and pasting, I'm going to navigate to File, I'm going to go down to Place, and I have this image of some clouds that I've already saved to my desktop. So I'm going to double click and add that in here. And I'm going to just stretch this out to fit what I have on screen. When I'm satisfied, I'm going to hit Enter. And this adjustment is really as simple as making sure that I have my clouds layer selected. And I'm going to click this drop down and change its layer mode to screen. And you'll notice that the white of the clouds is now the only thing that's visible, and we're seeing the gradient behind it. The blue, the pale blue of the sky, is close to white, so that's going to affect it just a little bit, but essentially this is a very clever way to change a sky, for example, or a piece of water, or something else, you know, where you want to add light accents to it. We could also come back here to our gradient layer, and I could change the gradient to something else if I wanted to, and the clouds will remain exactly as they were. So if I wanted to do something a little more natural looking, this is just a for fun image, so I'm going to leave it as it was for now. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add a ground. So again, I'm going to go to File, Place. I'm going to choose this image of a piece of terrazzo that I've downloaded from the internet. And again, I'm going to just go ahead and do a quick scale transformation to this to make it fill the page. With this, I just want to illustrate, again, masking techniques. So I only want to make this look like the ground, so I'm going to draw a marquee across the entire canvas. And I'm going to come down here to the Create a Mask button, and I'm going to mask my terrazzo. So now I have something of a ground. And again, this is a very surreal type of image that we're creating here. It's just for fun. This is not meant to be an example of a good representation, simply how these techniques work together. I could then create an adjustment layer on top of the terrazzo if I wanted. Say I wanted to make it a little bit darker. I could come down here, add an adjustment layer, for this one, I'm going to choose levels. I'm going to make it a little bit darker, I think. And then I'm going to hold Alt on the line between my levels adjustment and the terrazzo and clip it to the terrazzo so it's only affecting this one layer. I'm going to exit my properties. It's also sometimes good practice if you're clipping layers to each other to name them something that reflects that. So this one, I may name it terrazzo levels. I'm also going to name this pink gradient. Again, trying to keep up with layer management and layer organization. So let's say I wanted to add something that looks a little architectural to this scene. I could come up here, navigate to File, Place, and I have a piece of wood. So let's double click and add our wood to the document. Comes in a little bit large. I'm going to make it smaller anyway. Let's say I wanted to make this look like a wall. So I'm going to hit Enter and say that I'm satisfied with that placement, that initial placement. If I hold Control and hit T, I might want to perform a perspective adjustment to this. So I can right-click on my object, navigate to Perspective, and I'm going to skew this just a little bit and make this look like it's kind of seeding into the background just a little bit. Oop. Here we go. So that's not perfect, but it's pretty decent. Here we have a wooden wall on a terrazzo floor, and I'm changing my mind about this terrazzo adjustment that I've made. Let's say I actually want to make it a little bit lighter, so I may want to bring this closer to a white, so it's kind of a pale floor, because I'm thinking that I may want to cast a shadow on it. So I'm going to go ahead and again exit this adjustment, illustrating the benefit of using adjustment layers rather than destructive editing technique. If you change your mind about something, you can always go back and change it later. I'm also going to change my wood, selecting this layer, holding Control T, and then I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller so it fits on the page. So here we have a wooden wall on a terrazzo ground with a pink sky behind us. And let's bring back our potted plant as well. I'm going to bring this up towards the top of the layer stack, and I'm going to put it in front of the wood wall. So let's say, as a final adjustment, that we wanted to add some shadows to this. One way that you can add shadows very quickly is by generating a selection based on the image. Just as you can generate a selection based on a layer mask, you can generate a selection based on an image that has limited pixels. So I could hold Control and click on this wooden wall, and it's going to go ahead and generate a selection for me that matches this wood wall. I could then come just below it and say I want to make a hard shadow that looks kind of like this wooden wall. I'm going to come down here to my solid color fill layer and make a solid color that's black. By default, it comes in underneath the wall. If I hold Control and T, I can then begin to manipulate it. So say I hold Control and grab this top handle here, I could start to cast a shadow and make it look a little bit like the wall is actually throwing this shadow. I may want to rotate it around and try to match it best I can. But since this is just for fun, I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm going to hit Enter. And a nice technique for adding shadows to your Photoshop images that looks somewhat natural is to use a black fill layer and change its mode to multiply. Then if you reduce the opacity ever so slightly, you're going to get this nice black shadow where you can control exactly how heavy it is or how dark it appears, but you're going to be able to see the ground below it, which is a little more realistic. You know, when we see shadows in real life, they don't completely obscure the things that are below them, they just sort of darken it. And to illustrate that same point, again, with the potted plant, I could generate a selection based on its mask here, holding Control and clicking on it. And then again, coming just below it, I can create another solid fill. I'm going to choose black this time again. And now, because I want to affect the mask, I'm going to select the mask, hold Control, and hit T. We can also transform our masks, which is kind of a cool feature of Photoshop. And if I were to just grab this handle, this is actually very helpful with entourage and plantings. I could bring this down here, and that's a pretty easy way to generate a relatively reasonable shadow of this plant. So that actually looks pretty good, I think. And I'm going to again set this to multiply mode and turn my opacity down to something that matches the wall. So now we've got this kind of funny scene here. And one final note about shadows is that if you really want to strive for extreme realism in your images, which you're not required to, but just to be aware of the way that light works, you may also think about the difference between hard shadows, which come from a definite light source, such as a sun, and soft shadows, which sort of more naturally occur due to ambient light conditions just in our atmosphere. So if you wanted to start adding softer shadows or shading or painting into your drawing, you can also add fill layers. I'm going to add a black fill layer here. Came in with a completely white layer mask, so we're seeing it everywhere. I'm going to hold Control-I and invert that layer mask so I have a black canvas to work on. And I could come in here with my paintbrush tool, and if I wanted, I could affect it by playing with its size and its shape. I could squash it just a little bit, make it kind of flat. And now with my white activated, I could come in here and paint just a little bit of softness around the base of my potted plant. And now that's really starting to look, although it's a silly image overall, it has a bit of realism, and it's sort of showing an awareness of how light works and how shadows behave. So that covers this software primer. This is the second part of the Adobe Photoshop tutorial. Again, just to review what we discussed, we talked about working with layer masks. We discussed adding fill layers to your document. We discussed how to modify your layer masks by filling into them, by painting in them, and also by adding a layer mask and pasting an image into the layer mask directly. We discussed gradients versus solid fills. We discussed using masks to create selections. We also discussed the importance of using smart objects rather than simply cutting and pasting, organizing layers, transforming objects, layer effects, layer styles, clipping adjustment layers to each other, and then we had this exercise where we put it all together with this fun little collage image. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next software primer.